Okay, so now we get to one of my very favorite parts of the lecture, part 3, taking a look at the democracy of species, which is a phrase that Robin Wall Kimmerer coins in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. I say she coins it, but I'm sure others have mentioned it as well, as we'll see. We'll talk about Gregory Kahete and some other people who have had similar phrases or concepts to discuss. But that concept, the democracy of species, comes from traditional ecological knowledge and traditional indigenous philosophies in how you relate to the land. So it's just one phrase to describe many different ways of approaching the land that have very similar values and ways of relating to the other beings with whom we share this land. All right, so let's take a look. So the democracy of species can there's different ways to define it, but I was trying to think of a really kind of concise way to put it together. And the best way I could think of was to say, for humans, the democracy of species means being an honorable relative/citizen, living in complex, respectful relationship with other beings of the community. And by the community, I mean the community of the land to which you belong, right? So for humans, because I feel that's the only way we can really adequately define something, is what does it mean? The democracy of species means to a coyote or a deer. I don't, those are other topics to have other discussions. But for humans, what does the democracy of species mean? And that means coming from these tribal cultures with similar ideas, values about the relationship we should have as human beings to the land. The democracy of species means, as a human, being an honorable relative or citizen, living in complex, respectful relationship with other beings of the community of the land to which we all belong. And when I say the community of the land, I don't just mean the earth is general. Of course, that's true. But I mean a specific and particular area of land to which you are rooted as a human being, that you have roots there. You aren't just jumping about the surface, going from coast to coast and enjoying nature's beauty and, having little encounters here and there. You are developing a relationship with a particular land, the animals and plants and other beings who inhabit that land. And you, through those relationships, are creating community with those other beings of the land. And that community, if you're lucky, you're one of those humans who has intergenerational roots in that particular land. So you have community, as your human community of which you are a part, has long-standing relationships with these other beings who also share that land with you. The TEK approach, the Traditional Ecological Knowledge approach to how we should live with the land. I want to take a big long quote from Gregory Kahete in his book Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence. And you can take a look at this, but essentially that first paragraph is saying that the Western world, in particular Western science, has written off Native American philosophies as part of a primitive stage of human intellectual development, as worshiping animals. And Western science, in other words, and Western culture in general, has had a really difficult time understanding indigenous thought on how we relate to the world. It gets written off as something that is irrelevant and primitive. But the core idea that Gregory Kahete is saying here, he says the environmental movement is rediscovering these ideas that indigenous peoples have had for millennia. Indigenous peoples, like I said, we all come from these tribal roots somewhere along our ancestral heritage. And the environmental movement back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s really started recovering those ideas of the indigenous people's ways of being and said, wow, this is really cool. What happened? Why did we stop doing this? Why did we get on such a strange track? And the part I really want to highlight here that relates to democracy of species is that this whole concept of animal rights that's talked about in the Western world today, that's nothing new to indigenous peoples. As Gregory Kahete says, for native peoples, animals have always been considered to have rights and were equal to human beings in terms of right to their lives and to their perpetuation as species. One could describe these beliefs as a type of natural democracy. So this idea, and that emphasis is mine, but the words are his, that idea of the democracy of species is essentially living together in community with respect for the rights of all other beings to live in the same way that you think you should be able to live, i.e. that is, you have the right to freedom, you have, liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness is something that isn't just human specific. It is something that applies to all beings, and we must respect that. We must respect that, and it doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean that, it's much easier to just not have to care how you impact other people. Easier in the sense that then you don't have to think so hard about, well, how do we do this or how do we that? Certainly not easier emotionally. I'm not making that argument by any means. But the idea is we have to be thoughtful and mindful about our actions in how we live our daily lives, how we live our lives in a lifetime, how we live our lives as a community, as a species. We have to be very mindful and thoughtful when we live from this ideological worldview, how are we impacting all of our relatives? They have a right to liberty, life, and pursuit of happiness just as much as we do, right? And we need to respect that while we're also balancing out the need to live, the need to survive. The traditional ecological knowledge approach not only, I wouldn't argue only, I should say, that it's the most ethical way in which to relate to this earth. In fact, anthropologists would also say it's the most sustainable way that we have in human history. But you also learn so much from this approach. You're not just learning, you're not separating yourself from the community of the land and sitting back as though you don't exist, as though you're not impacting your surroundings. You aren't removing Western science, emphasizes you are not a part of it. You can't interact in anything that's going on. You are removed from what you're studying. Western science also emphasizes do not become emotionally attached to that. It's a very thing oriented. Those beings aren't usually referred to as who's. You can't become emotionally attached to them, so you give them numbers instead of names. You're supposed to keep all this isolation. You're supposed to keep yourself in isolation. And in this way, by some magical means of completely isolating yourself from any connection to the world, you're supposed to learn about the world. TEK believes in full submersion and connection with the world. That the way you learn is from all of your senses, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, with all of your senses engaged. And really making connections. You learn through relationships, you learn through connections. So there's a lot that traditional ecological knowledge has to impart that again has been written off by Western science. Is just so much folklore, is so much, primitive understandings of things. When in fact it's a body of knowledge that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And most of that in a particular area or region of land. So this is vast reservoirs of knowledge. That come from relationships with a particular land and the beings who call that place home. A couple of examples of information that TEK has known about and, comes from tribal societies that have this generations deep rooted connection to a particular piece of land and generations deep relationships and understandings, observations of interactions with the other beings, the other animals and plants and what have you of the land to which they all belong, is the Australian firehawk. For decades after colonization, there were people from the Aboriginal communities in Australia who said, yeah, there's this firehawk. When there's a fire going on, this hawk swoops in, grabs something that's burning, probably a burning branch or whatever is handy, and flies away with it and sets fire to grasses that aren't burning, and then swoops in to, catch any of the prey, like mice or whatever that might run out of that small patch of burning grass fire. And for years, Western science like, yeah, right. That's just those Aborigines, they get kind of crazy, that whole folklore thing, all the superstition thing, and they just totally wrote it off until, and this is telling too, until some Western scientists actually observed this. And then the Western scientific community started to pay attention. So some Western scientists noticed and obviously took pictures that there are indeed these Australian firehawks who, when there is a fire, they take advantage of the fire. They grab a burning twig or burning branch. They fly to a place that isn't burning. They drop the branch, set the grass on fire, and then they wait for mice or other small rodents or whomever to come out of that fire. And that's how they hunt. One of the ways that they hunt. Another example of the knowledge that TEK can bring you, it comes from Africa. The Yao have, this could go back 2 million years or more. This is a really old tradition, a really old relationship with a bird called the greater honeyguide. And there is a particular call, every community, every human and honeyguide relationship, community relationship is different. But in the Yao communities, so tradition passed down from father to son, there's a particular whistle that you can give, and this greater honeyguide will come to this person who gives that whistle, and, there's like this, okay, here we are, we're meeting, we're interacting, and then the greater honeyguide flies off into the nearby woods and leads the people, if there's any honey to be found, to a bee's nest, leads them to where the honey is, and then the people get the honey out, open up the honey, and the greater honeyguide is also able to access that honey. And so the two is a mutually beneficial relationship. The human who knows how, knows the call, gives that whistle and calls the greater honeyguide. The honeyguide comes, leads that human to where the source of honey is. The human gets down the source of honey, the beehive, and opens it up, and both the honeyguide and the human can enjoy the honey inside. So this is a very, very old relationship that goes back who knows how far. Up here in the North Woods, the Anishinaabe, there's another example. One of, like I said, so many, is just so rich with this kind of examples of what you can learn if you approach learning from the land through a TEK or traditional ecological knowledge perspective, treating all your beings as relatives that you live with on that land. Mayingan, or the wolf trail, is a celestial phenomenon that you'll find in the night sky. And the Mayingan is the it's the path that these particular stars take throughout the night sky throughout the year. Each of the stars that travel on this path are known as wandering wolves. And these are particular stars that in Western science we know as our planets. The Anishinaabe viewed these stars, noticed that they had a particular path across the sky, noticed that these particular stars had a particular path across the sky. They called them the wandering wolves. But not only that, the reason they called them the wandering wolves was based on, one, wolf behavior, and two, star behavior. So this is an awesome example of how thoroughly you can understand the universe in which you inhabit. So the land which you inhabit, that whole the world that you're in. So the Anishinaabe knew from their interactions with wolves and observations with wolves, the relationships with wolves, they understood that wolves, when they reached a certain age, the juvenile wolves would head off onto the landscape. So right here in the North Country, we also have an excellent example of how the traditional ecological knowledge approach can really give you so much insight and understanding into the area in which you inhabit. So the Anishinaabe have a name for a particular celestial phenomenon in our night skies that they call the Mayingan or Makan. I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name. Mayingan Makan, I believe, or the Wolf Trail. And this is a particular celestial phenomenon that has particular stars that travel across this on a nightly basis. And, as their movements across the sky that change throughout the year. In the Western world, we know this path is the path that the planets take across our night sky. The Anishinaabe noticed that these stars were different than the other stars, and they named the stars that were on this path the wandering wolves. So the stars that we know of in Western science as the planets, the Anishinaabe, were known as the wandering wolves, and the trail that these wandering wolves take across the night sky was known as Mayingan Makan, or the Wolf Trail. The reason the Anishinaabe called these stars the wandering wolves comes from both their observation of the stars and their understanding of wolves. The Anishinaabe, through their very close relationship with the land, through that whole traditional ecological knowledge approach, understanding that all beings are our relations, and the Indigenous science approach that you engage all of your senses and you learn through the connections and relationships you have with the land and with the beings of the land. Through that Indigenous science and that philosophical approach, the Anishinaabe understood and knew that wolves, once they reached a certain age, would go out, would leave their pack, many would leave their pack in search of mates, and they would wander across the landscape until they found a pack to belong to, or until they found a mate and formed their own pack. So when they looked at the stars, and they saw these stars on this particular trail, the Wolf Trail, Mayengan-Mikan, these stars, in the Western scientific worldview, we know that these stars as planets can appear to go backwards in the night sky. Unlike any of the other stars, these stars sometimes go in the same direction, and then over a period of time, they appear to move backwards. And this has to do with how our planets are laid out in our solar system and where the Earth is at any given time in relation to those planets, because we're all on this same plane. We're not in an astronomy class, so I don't need to go in any deeper. Just know it has to do with, it's called the retrograde motion of the planets, and it has to do with how the planets are laid out in the solar system and how the Earth is related to those planets at any given time. Our movements in the solar system can give the appearance that these stars are moving backward along this trail. So the Anishinaabe, noting that the stars went back and forth along Mayengan-Mikan, along the Wolf Trail, and knowing the behavior of wolves when they reach a certain age and are wandering across the landscape looking for a mate, they decided to call these stars in the night sky the wandering wolves. So what a perfect example. You know, this didn't take telescopes, this didn't take radio collars, this just took an intimate understanding of not only the night skies, but also of the beings with whom the Anishinaabe shared this land. Traditional ecological knowledge is, used by many tribal, it's really, a lot of tribal governments today have what they call natural resource departments, which is really unfortunate in my opinion, because it's using Western concepts, in part to gain respectability within the Western world. But as we seek to gain respectability with the colonizing culture, we also start to colonize our own minds and hearts, because when we don't stand for who we are, we start to stand for whom the other stands, other is, and that is how our gradual erosion of tribal identity, cultural identity starts to happen. If you think about it, in Europe was full of tribal people until Christianization and then eventually colonization, or sometimes the two together, followed. And today you see where the cultural traditions of tribal Europe stand. And this had to do with, year after year of assimilating gradually bit by bit into that mainstream colonizing culture. And that's what happened. So if we start forming and keep on the habit that's currently going on of forming natural resource departments and other things within our tribal governments, we are accepting that Western colonial worldview of the world. And there are others who argue for, standing on your own feet and being who we are as, who people are as Indigenous people, saying this is who we are. This is who we are unapologetically. And you have so much to learn from this approach. And this is where we're going to stand and who we are going to be. So one example of how traditional ecological knowledge has actually worked its way into legislation is the 2003 Nunavut Wildlife Act. Nunavut is an Indigenous-run province up in Canada that I believe was approved back in the 1990s. But it passed this Wildlife Act in 2003 using Inuit traditional ecological knowledge. I do not speak the language that this is in, but this is how their Wildlife Act looks, and I think it's really neat that what these words are that you see here are actual principles from the traditional ecological knowledge of the Inuit, the Inupiat, others who live in Nunavut. So they will say, here's this one concept, which is also called this. This means that hunters should hunt only what is necessary for their needs and not waste the wildlife they hunt. So right in the Nunavut Wildlife Act, if you are going to hunt in Nunavut, you need to hunt only if you need to, only you have there's a necessary reason to, because you have a need. And when you do hunt, you can't waste the wildlife you hunt. So just going out like the predator challenges we have in the Upper Peninsula, this would be a violation of the 2003 Nunavut Wildlife Act, because those coyotes are not being there. I've seen pictures of just cartloads of coyotes being taken away. These are probably posted by the coyote hunters on Facebook and just dumped, right? So this would be a violation of the 2003 Nunavut Wildlife Act. These are just examples. I'm not giving you the whole thing. You can certainly look it up on your own, but I'm giving you some examples. This particular TEK concept means that even though wild animals are harvested for food and other purposes, malice towards them is prohibited. So the idea is you may be hunting these animals, but you don't do it with a mean spirit. You do it in a good way. You don't approach these animals in a way that is mean, really. You have respect for these animals. Another concept that's in the Wildlife Act, this particular one means that hunters should avoid causing wild animals unnecessary suffering when harvesting them. So you're going to be a good hunter and you want to be mindful of the fact that they are going to suffer when you do this, but you need to hunt them as much in as good a way as you can, right? You're not doing this for fun. You're not doing this to see how much you can make a wounded deer run or whatever. You know, there are people out there that do this kind of thing. This principle, I know, is also part of some of here in the United States, some of the training that like deer hunter safety training classes. I went to one that my dad was conducting a, what do you call it? When you're using the compass into the woods, you know, I can't think of the word right now, but anyway, I attended an archery workshop there, a training workshop for the folks who were getting their deer hunter safety license. It was young people, and they were talking about how you want to respect the deer. When you're a bow hunter, you are looking to make sure that you minimize the suffering of the animal. So there are echoes, you know, I know in American hunters too, who have a respect for the animal. Another principle of the 2003 Nunavut Wildlife Act, this one means that wildlife and habitat are not possessions, so hunters should avoid disputes over the wildlife they harvest or the areas in which they harvest them. In other words, we don't own the animals. They are not something we have or people that we can own. So hunters don't own these animals. Nobody owns these animals. I'm going to get to conflict with the Western scientific community in a minute that kind of pertains to these last two principles as well. Finally, the last principle I want you to be aware of is this one, which means that all wildlife should be treated respectfully. In particular, these last three principles apply to what I'm going to talk about now. When this 2003 Nunavut Wildlife Act was initially passed, it included a prohibition of radio collaring polar bears because they felt that the radio collaring was treating the wildlife disrespectfully, was treating them as possessions, and it was causing the animals unnecessary suffering. And you can look different things up, but there's a number of, you know, Inuit and Inupiat hunters who have been out there and said they've seen the wildlife that's been collared, and they've documented and detailed, you know, the abrasions that the radio collars are causing, or the other forms of suffering that radio collaring is causing. And the polar bear is greatly respected among these cultures up there, and they had enough of it. They said, we can't keep having these polar bears treated this way, so they actually made it illegal. This caused such a huge outcry in the Western scientific community. What? We can't radio collar polar bears? How are we going to, you know, track the changes of climate change, the impacts of climate change on polar bears? So there's so much intense pressure put on Nunavut that they actually did end up taking that out of the Wildlife Act. The government did. I imagine, given the opposition to radio collaring that's among the non-governmental people who are out there hunting and whatnot, who are, you know, Inuit and Inupiat and other Indigenous folks who live up there, that they were not very happy with this. And one of the answers, you know, of course, to, well, how else are we going to see how climate change is impacting the polar bears, is like, well, get to know them. Form a relationship with them. Go ask the traditional hunters who have these generations old relationships with polar bears and see what changes they've seen. So there's numerous ways to get this information that don't have to involve a violation of these last three principles when it comes to obtaining this information, this knowledge. Another example of the traditional ecological knowledge approach to well, I don't know, just an interesting situation. Many of you know about Royale and how a few years ago the wolf populations that were there were so decimated that the moose population was greatly increasing and, you know, causing damage through what, you know, the browsing they were doing as an overpopulated species on a limited space. We all know what overpopulation can do to an area, so that's what was happening the moose on Isle Royale. And of course the wolves were predators of the moose, and so on. There was very few wolves they weren't able to hunt the moose, and the wolves weren't doing well, and they were like, I think it was a father and a son or something like that. And when they were close family members, there was not a breeding population either in Isle Royale. So there was a lot of controversy over, well, what do we do with this? What do we do with this situation? And from the Western scientific perspective, the one that held out was we need to relocate wolves from their traditional territories where they're living now, take them away from there and bring them to Isle Royale so that we can infuse the current wolf pack there with new blood, and they can grow to be a big wolf pack again, and, help bring the moose population under control. And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, that'd be great. That's really great. Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa in 2017 came out opposing that. They opposed the relocation of wolves to Isle Royale. And let's be clear here, when we talk about relocating animals, we're talking about a forced relocation of animals, just like when many native tribes were forced to relocate from their traditional homes through colonialism. We don't want you living here. You go live over there where you're not bothering us right now. This is a situation that's like, well, we need you here, so we're going to remove you from here, and we're not asking your permission. We're just doing it. So you may have family connections. You may have a life here that you love. It doesn't matter to us. We've selected you for this forced removal, and so we are taking you to Isle Royale. That all was part of what played into the Grand Portage decision, but here's what they had to say. This is just an excerpt from the paper, or the letter that they wrote to the National Park Service. But essentially, they're saying the Grand Portage Band observes a cultural value that allows for natural cycles of predators and prey, and a cultural philosophy of management only when necessary. And they felt Isle Royale was not a time for interventionist policy of management. They call it here, they said, we urge a non-interventionist policy for management of wildlife in Isle Royale. Maintaining unmanaged wilderness is most appropriate, they argued. And then they go on to point out what most people, probably to this day, still do not know, that wolves have not been on Isle Royale for all that long. They've only been there since 1949. In fact, wolves came over on ice bridges to Isle Royale back in 1949, and some of them stayed. Grand Portage says, we've been here. This island has been important to our tribal culture and history for generations, and we know through this history that natural introductions and extinctions on the island go back for generations. This is a normal cycle for this island, for this rise and fall of things to happen like this. And then they point out that this is ignored. And then they say, we feel that there is sufficient opportunity for wolves to decide on their own whether or not they want to be on this island. There are ice bridges, and they pointed out to an ice bridge that formed in 2015 that, people could cross, wolves could cross from the mainland to the island. They said there were actually wolves who did cross on an ice bridge back in 2015. They stayed on the island for a few days, and then they decided to leave, to go back to the mainland. So they said, we know that ice bridges continue to form. We know that mainland wolves are going to the island. They're just not staying. So let the wolves decide. Wolves know best what they need to do for themselves. And, the island has this cycle. Our traditional ecological knowledge tells us that the island has these kind of cycles. And Grand Portage went on to say, well, ice bridges may be less common than they have been in the past. They still occur. The opportunity for natural repopulation would likely be impeded by a reintroduction event. So if you bring in wolves from somewhere, the natural repopulation of the island, this natural cycle is going to be disturbed because you're bringing other wolves in. So scientists should study, they say, natural change first and then determine an appropriate pathway forward. So it was interesting. They came out in opposition in this way. And the tribe had a lot of pressure. National Park Service says, well, we're really going to do this. We're going to do this. So is there some way we can work with you to make it a little better, have a little more of a common ground? So Grand Portage actually said, okay, if you're going to do this, then use wolves from the local area to bring to island, because if you're bringing these outside wolves from other places, not only are you going to interrupt this natural cycle of the island, because, if we have strange wolves in an area, our local wolves are going to be much more reluctant to go to the island. not only going to interrupt that with wolves from the outside, you're going to also bring in the chance of diseases or other issues like, heartworm and other sort of things that if you bring those wolves there and they have these sicknesses, they can impact our local wolves. So we want you, if you're going to really do this, use the local wolves. So the National Park Service tried. When they captured, I forget how many it was, like 3 or 4 wolves overall, not necessarily all at one time. But one of the wolves died as part of the capture process. I think they didn't come out of anesthesia, if I remember correctly. And the other wolves they've got on the island, none of them stayed. They didn't want to stay there, right? So they're trying to force a situation where the local wolves, who also, by the way, have been part of the community of the relationships of the land for generations, like the Grand Portage Ojibwe did. So the National Park Service actually ended up bringing in wolves from the outside area, and they have taken to the pack on the island, and the National Park Service got what it wanted. But what was really interesting, I found out later that Grand Portage, this whole wolf study issue thing, is the only scientific project of its kind. So it really made me wonder: were people working so hard to save the island as they had known it since 1950s, or were they working to save a scientific research project, right? And Grand Portage, meantime, the Indigenous community that has the relationship with the island that goes back generations, their voice is listened to somewhat, but the real gist of it is ignored. And people are saying there is a natural cycle here. There's a whole relationship you're missing because you're so bent and focused on what you think is best for this island. And you're not just sitting back and letting nature take its course. You're not letting the island knowing what's best for the island, the wolves knowing what's best for wolves, and all that whole cycle happening. You're determining what should happen, and you're actually ignoring and missing the much bigger picture of what's been happening here for generations. And how will colonial society know that? Because it hasn't been here for very long on Turtle Island in North America. So the people that do know that, the Indigenous folks, are not being listened to. Finally, I want to wrap up with this image here that is actually, it was a petition. Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission has this, and other people have talked about it. And according to them, this was a petition signed by some of the clan leaders of the Anishinaabe people in expressing their desire to stay on their land. So we have Ajajak the crane on the far right, number 1. We have some other animals represented, 2, 3, and 4. There's different. We have the fish clan, number 7. These different clans, and if you notice, there's that little red spot right here. You can see my cursor, and its lines connect to these hearts here, right? Every animal has a heart, a red spot there, that's connected back to Ajajak, or the crane's heart, because Ajajak the crane is considered the leadership clan, one of the leadership clans. So when Ajajak speaks, she is speaking for all of the clans, because Ajajak has listened to those clans and what the clans want him or her to say. So Ajajak is speaking for all the clans, and so all their hearts are connected. And then you see this other line going up to the crane's head, Ajajak's head. And then do you see how everybody's head also comes to the crane, right? Everybody is connected. We are speaking with one heart and one mind. And then the crane, speaking with the hearts and minds of all the clan members who are represented here, the Anishinaabe, is connected to what here is the shoreline of Lake Superior. Here, I think that was a river. I'd have to look that up. And here are some wild ricing lakes. So in other words, this is a petition saying, we want to stay in our land. We are connected in our hearts and our minds about this issue. We are also connected in our hearts and our mind to the land in which we live, the land to which we belong, the land to which we have this relationship that goes back generations. And for me, this petition right here really epitomizes that whole idea of the traditional ecological knowledge approach to how we relate to the land. It is how we should be connected through our hearts and our minds in a really deep way to this whole entire land that we exist here, through the animals, through the water beings, through, everything. It was on birch bark too, so you even have the trees represented as well, right? So it's all of us connected together in community and in relationships that go back generations, relationships that help us all to understand one another. So that wraps up our overview of the philosophy of traditional ecological knowledge and what it can lead to in terms of how we relate to the land, and I hope gives you an idea of how deep this respect for the other relatives whom we share this land with, how deep that respect goes in this body of knowledge, and how informative that respect can be for this body of knowledge too, because through those respectful relationships that go back generations in a particular area, we learn so much. We learn so much that's invaluable, that in many cases can go back thousands of years. And that's something Western science can't duplicate. Western science, one, is really young, and two, isolates itself deliberately from relationship to the world. So it learns a part of the world. It doesn't learn the full scope and connections and relationships that exist in that world. And through that isolation, it believes it has the right to do things to these relatives that are completely appalling to those who have these connections, these relationships, and these respectful communities that have joined together for, time immemorial. So that's it. That wraps up the Havin Nunavut lectures in 3 parts. So look forward to your thoughts, look forward to your comments, and we will talk to you later. Mama P, see you later.